Hi guys, welcome back to Producing and Selling Graphic Stock. My name is Ben Gribbin and this is Technical Requirements. In this part of the course, we're going to show you all the technical specifications that your files are going to need to meet, the sort of skill level you need to be at, and where you need to aim, or what kind of quality level you need to aim for so that your files will sell well. When we think about graphic stock, Graphic River, which is Envato's graphic site, has several categories for files such as graphics, print templates, web elements, add-ons, icons, fonts, textures, and logos. In this course, we're going to be concentrating mainly on graphics, web elements, textures, but the principles can be applied to print templates, PowerPoint or presentation templates, as well as things like fonts, logos, whatever that you wish to sell in the future. Now, files that have to be, or when they are reviewed, they need to meet a certain level of quality and technical requirements. So, a file is reviewed in technical terms under the following areas. We're going to talk a little bit more into the details behind these and what it all means, but how useful the item is one of the main reviewing points. So when a file is actually checked, it's actually considered whether it's going to be used a lot, whether it's going to be used, how it's going to be used, whether the item is actually going to be useful to buyers, basically. The next point that it's reviewed for is whether the item contains any potentially offensive content, such as violence, sexual content, offensive language, anything that's racist, that sort of thing. So you need to make sure you're not including anything that pertains to drugs, violence, anything that might be potentially offensive. The aesthetic value of the item. Now, each item is reviewed on the kind of merits that it has in terms of its design. You need to make sure that your designs are good and appropriate to the style that you're working under. The standard of the item's construction, we're going to break that down in this lesson, but the standard can include many things like, does it meet minimum requirements for dimensions? Is it a certain file format? The item's level of customizability, that is something that's a key thing for buyers. They want to be able to edit and change absolutely everything, so being able to do so means it is a more valuable and useful file. Files are also checked in case they are based upon tutorials. So they need to make sure that, or reviewers make sure that the files haven't been just stolen off the internet by just basically having a knowledge of the web, following up on tutorials themselves, so that they know if they come across something that's been done from a high profile tutorial, they'll recognize that. Now, those are things that reviewers actively check for. Here are some things that might get your file rejected if you're not careful with your design and the way you formatted it. So the thing you need to do before you create any files is to go around the site, make sure that there aren't any similar files, because files can be rejected for that reason. A file needs to be exceptionally done and very unique. If, for example, it's within a very popular category, one which is quite saturated, you need to make sure your file does something different and original. If, for example, the file was corrupt, say your zip file doesn't open up or has been broken up upon upload, or just when you were compressing it, or if it included a virus, then your file would be rejected. If the item is difficult to use or implement, let's say it's very clunky, it's highly advanced, you haven't included enough instructions, then your file could be rejected because it's just not useful. If the item does not meet marketplace quality or aesthetic standards, then again it will be rejected. So that was something we will look into further into this course. One thing that Envato do is they actually every year will review the current level of quality and standards in the marketplace. If it isn't good enough, if a file is found to be no longer meeting those standards, then it may be removed. So the best thing to do in the first place is to make sure that your file is a high quality file. What we're going to do now though is we're going to look over some of the technical specs for items. So we're going to look over some of the technical requirements for the graphics category, which are essentially usually PSD files, though some of the files in, or some of the categories within this section, such as the backgrounds category, it might be acceptable for items such as JPEGs or PNGs to be included, or perhaps to be the entire file. This can then be, or those files can then be dropped straight into a design, but in general you don't want to be flattening layers, as a buyer may be purchasing your item just for one very small element within it. So if we go ahead and open up one of our own files, if we just go and find one of the course examples we've used on Tuts Premium, we can then go ahead and play around with it. We can show you how it would be formatted so that it is approvable. Let's just go ahead and open up this file here. This is just one I've been working on separately for another project. If I was to go ahead and merge all these layers, that file is no longer very useful. You can't move anything around, you can't change the colouring of it, you can't adjust anything whatsoever. It's just a flat graphic. Yes, okay, you can maybe drop it straight in to your file if you wanted, but when you leave it layered and organized, you can go through, you can move things around, you can adjust the general look and feel of a file, change the composition, and it just offers more editability for buyers. So it's recommended that where you can, use non-destructive editing, and that goes for pretty much every category that you want to work in. You should be ensuring that your file meets minimum recommended size for any categories. So if there is one, make sure that you make files meet the minimum requirements for categories. That includes things like minimum resolution. So this might be a little bit too low res to be approved on the graphics category. You want to make sure as well that because this is a complicated and quite layered up file, that you are actually naming and labeling your layers, which we're going to go through in a couple of lessons in this course. So make sure your file's easily navigatable by your buyer. Make sure that you use groups and layers. Design should be very high quality. They should be useful. We're going to help you look over what constitutes as something that is good and high quality in another lesson in the course. You need to make sure for the graphics category that you are not providing a print file, because that is not what the category is intended for. So everything should be formatted for web. It should be RGB color, 72 DPI. Obviously, you might want to include some print elements, so you can go ahead and do that, but don't make it the center or the main part of your file, because it's just overkill really, and it also slows down downloads for buyers. So if you wanted to do that, make sure you format things properly. Acceptable formats include PSD, which is what we're working with now, but you can also submit JPEG, PNG files. A PSD is more useful to buyers, as we've just shown you. You can completely edit it, you can change things around, changing colors, you can add adjustment layers, you can include adjustment layers, and so it's a lot better for editing and customizability later on. If you're using, instead of just going ahead and flattening a layer, I think, can I perhaps maybe change it into a smart object instead of rasterizing it, because that again makes a lot more sense, and it's just a lot more editable and usable later on. Adjustment layers, you should be including those and making sure you're not doing any destructive techniques such as flattening layers, merging them together where you don't need to do. Rasterizing a layer should be your very last option. Now, web elements, these are files that are usually GUI elements. They basically are designed so that they can be customized but then drop straight into a web design project, perhaps within Photoshop. These items generally haven't got a minimum file size dimension because a single button could be particularly small, so make sure that those are usable and also not too small. Make sure that the elements are very polished, very high quality, but also completely ready to be dragged into a design project without much editing, so maybe just changing text, for example, on a navigation bar. Don't include a color profile in these files, as it may alter the way it's displayed on a differently calibrated screen. So when you do save for the web, or when you're saving things, make sure you're not including or working within a color profile that is just basically applies to only your monitor, because it could cause color differentiations on your file. The files are broken down again. The web elements category is broken down into things like Facebook timeline covers, Twitter backgrounds, so you should be able to, or should be following Facebook and Twitter's sizing guidelines on those type of items. So if we look at these backgrounds here, you'll see that they are the correct size for Twitter, or the Twitter background option. Let's look at textures. Textures are generally files that are produced from high resolution photographs of surfaces, materials, that kind of thing. You should be using high quality camera and good professional lighting to make sure that your textures are sharp, making sure that it's got a very high resolution. The higher resolution, the better. So try to go over 2000 pixels square or 3000 pixels square as a minimum. And if you go ahead and make the texture seamless, then that again adds even more value to buyers. Offering seamless versions is just completely another step. It makes your file more refined and it gives buyers a lot more usability. So if you're not sure how to do that, it's very easy. You can check out this lesson, one of my other courses on Tuts Premium. So go ahead, check that out at this link. Something that you need to make sure is no matter what category you're working within, your files are not larger than 500 megabytes. Making sure they are a zip file, not a RAR file, nothing like that. Always make sure to provide links to help videos on YouTube, on another reputable video hosting website, rather than including them in the download, because that again slows down download times for buyers. It means there's more resources being used to host files, and also sometimes people include them as flash files, and that might mean that they're not entirely viewable on every system. So just including it on YouTube, providing a link in your help file, which you should be including, means it's a lot more easy. Here are some other things you shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be flattening fonts in a file so that they're not editable, because wherever you can, you need to work on that mantra of making your file as usable as possible. So editing text is one of the main crux points of that. Make sure your design is up to standard. Again, we're going to talk in more detail about that later on. And make sure your files are professionally executed, no rough edges, follow industry standards for whatever category you're working in. Don't be roughly cutting or tracing things out. If there are perspective issues or if things are wonky or pixely, it just lets the quality of the file down and it may well be, or probably will be, rejected. Anything that's considered cutting corners will result in a file that's not going to be approved. And then finally, you need to make sure that your file is organized, not disorganized, because that would cause issues for buyers. You'd probably get a lot of complaints. Maybe the rating of your file would be affected. So make sure that your file is very organized. And again, we're going to look at this in one of the lessons in this course. When you're all done, make sure you go ahead and compress them into a zip using a good zip software, which we'll talk through in the course. And these are just general things that reviewers are looking for. They're evaluating how well a file is built, how well it's made, and how useful it is to buyers. In this lesson, we've looked over the technical requirements for creating and producing graphic stock. Your task for the lesson is to remember these two things. Make your file as useful as possible and make it as editable as possible. Write these two key notes down and work by them. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at uploading files and how they should be prepped for upload. Thanks for watching.